watch a show or movie and think, oh damn, I think I missed out on a really cool and interesting opportunity here, because recently I had one of these moments and it really did hit me out of the blue and left me thinking about it for quite a while. And it does relate to a classic franchise, Avatar. And more specifically, we'll be talking about The Legend of Korra. Now, there's no doubt about it, Legend of Korra is one of the most iconic and defining animated series of the early 2010s, and really did pave the way for a whole host of other animated shows and series that would come out in the latter half of that decade and into the present with the early 2020s. And regardless of what you think about some of the plot developments or the story points or the character arcs, I do think there's no doubt about it, its impact is still very obvious in the current crop of animated works, at least from a TV perspective. I do feel like the animated film industry, or at least the mainstream industry, is still a bit more insulated from those trends as we've seen, as opposed to the world of live action, where you can see how different movies or shows have impacted the industry as a whole with genres and character arcs and all that sort of stuff. Twist villains, sudden deaths of key characters, you get me. But whilst Korra is very iconic and, in my eyes, very well written for the most part, I still have moments where I go, that would have been so good, / made so much sense, / would have been a really interesting plot point for the series to follow along with. And yeah, maybe you'll not like my idea, but who cares? I want to get it out there. And it's not actually a huge plot point that would actually change the entire course of the show, and really it wouldn't change much at all. It really wouldn't do anything other than flesh out the world of Avatar more, and link Korra back into the family. Or at least link her back in there directly. And that is by making Sokka her grandfather. And, already I can feel some people saying, oh, but that makes the world of Avatar feel so small, blah, blah, blah. Just such a massive coincidence that it just so happens that the Avatars reincarnated into the same family that he'd married into in their previous life. Feels unlikely. And yeah, I guess, sort of. But at the same time, I do feel like the population of the water tribes, quite small, and she's from the southern tribe, which is even smaller. And so, the pool you're drawing from is much reduced anyway compared to other nations, except air of course. So I don't really think it's out of the realm of possibility. And on top of that, everybody else's kids are mega important figures in the lore as well. Aang and Katara, 2 out of 3, they have a top general in the army. And they have the leader of the Air Nation. Zuko's the father of the Fire Lady and has a general for a grandson. And Toph's kids are the chief of police and straight up founded a full-on metal city. So would it really damage the story to make Sokka's descendants equally important to that? I personally don't think so. I think it's actually quite fun. And so yes, that brief rebuttal aside, there are a number of reasons that I do think tie back into this idea and show that it could have been a really interesting concept for the story to play with. Okay, so my main argument as to why I think this would be a fun idea is that we don't really have much information about Sokka and his life and what he got up to, what he did. We do know he was a leader in the Southern Water Tribe and helped revitalize their culture and civilization. And on top of that, we know he was an important piece in the founding of Republic City. And he served as a representative of the Southern Water Tribe on the council, and then he fought against the Red Lotus to protect Korra when they kidnapped her. Oh, and by the time of the series, he's dead. But beyond that, there's no mention of Suki, if they stayed together, which feels like the pretty obvious choice, and whether they had children or whatever. And so, I do think that by adding some of these connections, it helps to flesh out Sokka's life in an interesting way, without it feeling too forced. And really without needing to show massive flashbacks or have a lot of expositional dialogue. The reality is, for such a massive character, one of the big OG 3 heroes of The Last Airbender, when it comes time, in the sequel he's dead. Of all the OGs, only he and Aang seem to be dead. And Aang at least appears a couple of times, and his impact is felt throughout the course of the show. Zuko straight up appears, Katara appears, and Toph appears, and once again, their impact and their legacy is felt throughout the show. Sokka gets nothing. Hell, even the Southern Water Tribe, you'd be thinking that his descendants would be the chief, right? Well, it doesn't seem to be true. In the end, it's Tonrak that's chosen. And I don't know, I kind of want his line to continue. Yeah, not everybody has kids, but poor old Sokka just feels like the writing screws him over. And so by having Korra be his granddaughter, I do think it links him back into the story in a much bigger way. And it just feels right. And on top of that, I kind of think it would be pretty funny. Sokka is famously a non-bender, and he cops a fair bit of shit for that throughout the series, with many people underestimating his abilities because of it. He's the regular guy. He's surrounded by 4 of the most powerful benders ever. Avatar Aang, Zuko, who brings firebending back to its original roots and restores the Fire Nation's glory, Katara, who's just waterbending 101, and Toph, who invented metal bending. Then next to him, he's Sokka. He makes plans and he uses his sword. I think therefore having Senna be his kid and then Korra her kid is kind of fun and somewhat ironic, because the character who I'd argue is probably the most powerful bender we've ever seen on screen, is descended from the character who famously had no powers and would often complain about that fact. And it just makes me giggle thinking about how crazy his celebrations would have been once he found out this fact. And also his then shocked and potentially despairing reaction to him, from a certain point of view, being Aang's new granddad. So yeah, from that point of view, even though he's dead by the time of the show, I think it adds some depth to his story, just adds a little bit to it. As well as adding something to Senna's story, Korra's mum, because let's be real, in canon she's just a supportive mum, that's all she is. Tonrak gets way more focus, and in the end it's his relationship with Korra that actually matters. And so I think this would give a little bit extra to that as well and flesh out Korra's life a bit more. Add to the joint backstory. And look, it wouldn't even need to dramatically alter the plot. It would just add a couple of scenes, some lines of dialogue here or there, nothing too fancy, nothing too dramatic, just adding some depth and some overall narrative importance to the role of Korra's mum and what she represents. The overall story still works exactly the same, even if this is the case. And so that's part of the reason as to why I think it's a bit of a missed opportunity, because it wouldn't have derailed the story and it would have enhanced the relationships of a lot of different characters. And we see this again, where it could have added a little bit to Korra's interactions with the other descendants of Team Avatar. Nothing that really changes things, I guess, because no matter what, Tenzin's still a father figure, Bumi's still a weird uncle type, and Kai's a cool aunt. The kids would remain like little siblings / little cousins, and yet at the same time, I do think it adds a little bit of emotional depth and gravitas, adds some layers from the get-go. It's not a necessary addition, not a necessary change, but it just adds that initial connector, especially since those three adults do interact with her in ways that reflect the dynamic with Sokka and Katara. Well, less so with Bumi maybe, but Tenzin and Kaya especially have pretty important scenes in the show and the comics where they just sit down with Korra and they shoot the shit. They give her comfort, discuss life, and look after her. And to me, that's very much a reflection of Katara's mothering of Sokka, especially when Tenzin just straight up loses his temper at her. Now that's some peak Katara raging at Sokka callback. And so that change, it's not a necessary shift, and it's not one that dramatically changes the relationships between all these characters. Everything would still flow the same, but I do think it would add a bit more of a narrative connection. And I think it would have been an interesting path for the story to explore. But wait, there's more! Because it also gives the opportunity to expand the storyline surrounding Tonrak and sort of fill in the blanks, so to speak. So, we know that he was the son of the chief, right? Or the king, or whatever they call it in the North Pole. And his brother Unalaq crafts this conspiracy to get him banished from the North Pole so he can ascend instead of him and advance his own plots and schemes. And all of this gets its payoff with the Dark Avatar arc. We know that Tonrak makes his way to the South Pole to live out his life in exile. We know that he meets Senna and he gets married. They have Korra and he becomes a pillar of the community. A leader, and pretty much their unofficial leader whilst they're still under the Northern rule. But how? Surely his reputation would be in tatters for the same reason that it was in tatters in the North. The whole Spirit Grove incident. Surely he would have been somewhat looked down on by the South Pole people. And I mean, in the comics we even see there's a major North-South divide. So how's this Northern reject able to overcome the stigma of being from the North, for one, but also banished for heretical actions against the spirits that could have straight up destroyed the North Pole? And so, having that story of him falling in love with and marrying Sokka's daughter seems to be a big way out of that predicament. You know, not that he planned it. He's not a Unalaq level schemer, but once the big dog accepts you, so to speak, well, I'd say you're at the stage of forgiveness. As opposed to in the normal canon where you're just like, well, I guess they didn't care at all. They just accepted him straight up. And so, yeah, maybe it was a little bit of hyperbole for me to say that this is the biggest missed opportunity of all time, but at the same time, I do think it's an addition that really only had upsides and could have fleshed out a story and added a bit more depth. You know, not that it's lacking depth to begin with, but there's always room for more in my eyes. And yeah, honestly, you could probably still do it through a soft retcon, but I'm doubtful they ever would. And so yeah, not much else to say really. I don't want to ramble on too long, so we'll call it here and now I'll throw it to you. What do you think about this little plot thread? Would it have been cool? Maybe I'm delusional, maybe you think it would have been stupid. I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know.